This is America, and this is the Israeli embassy here in Washington, D.C. Benjamin Netanyahu has been sitting down for talks today with Donald Trump, discussing peace in the Middle East. The question is the relationship between the two men a help or a hindrance when it comes to achieving it? I'll have more on that in a few minutes' time. First, let's go to our Washington, D.C. studio and Alex Marquardt.
Thank you, Richard. For years, President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have shared one of the closest political alliances on the world stage. It has often been more transactional than ideological, but both men are said to have similar governing styles, rallying a broad base of right-wing voters against the media and legal institutions as they denounce their political enemies. Now, their political interests are also diverging, this time over the Iran war. Let's take a look back at how this relationship has unfolded. Back on May,
fellow Americans, today I want to
U.S. from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated by his predecessor, President Barack Obama. That was a deal that Netanyahu had strongly opposed. Just days later, Trump officially moved the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. That went against decades of U.S. diplomacy that had kept the U.S. embassy in Tel Aviv due to the contested status of Jerusalem. Then, in 2019, President Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, the territory captured from Syria in the 1967 war. The move reversed decades of U.S. policy, and Netanyahu marked that moment by unveiling a new settlement named Ramat Trump, or Trump Heights. In September of 2020, the Trump administration brokered the Abraham Accords, normalization agreements between Israel and three Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. Then, in December of 2025, after Trump carried out strikes on the Iranian nuclear facilities in June of that year, Netanyahu awarded him the Israel Prize for service to the state, becoming the first non-Israeli to receive that honor. And then, just 2 months later, U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran began, with major potential consequences for the global economy and Trump's political standing. For more, let's over to the White House, where correspondent Manuel Rapallo joins us live. So, Manny, this is a big moment for both leaders, a big meeting. What do we know about that meeting?
Well, I can tell you that this meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrives at a moment of heightened tensions here with the ongoing conflict with Iran. For Israeli Prime Minister, there was this expectation ahead of this meeting today at the White House that there would be some sort of push by the Prime Minister to get President Trump to continue his maximum pressure campaign against Iran to ensure that the Iranians would not be able to rebuild their nuclear program, to not be able to rebuild their ballistic weapons program. President Trump is finding himself trying to balance in this regard what the Israelis want versus what could necessarily be best for U.S. interests. The dual message that we've been hearing consistently from the Trump administration is a warning to Iran that if they were to restart their nuclear program, that they could face a new phase of this war, a return to harsher strikes, military strikes by the United States. But in that same breath, President Trump continues to say that the United States is close to reaching a deal with Iran, saying that, quote, there's a good chance of reaching a diplomatic agreement here. So, again, there was this expectation that today's meeting would not be so narrowly focused on Iran, that there would be other topics, more broad topics as they relate to the U.S. goals of securing stability in the Middle East region, discussion about the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, the expansion of the Abraham Accords, which seeks to expand normalization of Israel among countries in the region, and as well as the rise in settler violence in the West Bank. I think what we'll be looking closely to over the course of the next few days is whether or not Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu left the White House on Tuesday more aligned than before with the administration, especially as it relates to that balance that I referred to. Is Israel going to be more aligned with the United States in terms of striking that balance between diplomacy and military pressure, striking that balance as it relates to the conditions that Iran would need to meet to avoid further military action, as Richard Gaisford explains?
It started as a joint military operation, with the US and Israel coordinating attacks on Iran, an attempt to bring regime change and stop Iranians from building nuclear bombs. In the early days of the war, the US Secretary of State suggested Israel led the way.
We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties.
That narrative soon changed, and the president was optimistic that he could get the job done.
We have the strongest and most powerful, by far, military in the world, and we will easily prevail.
Now, 5 months since the war began, it seems President Trump's more concerned with the shorter-term goal of opening up the Strait of Hormuz.
How much patience do you have left with Iran, sir?
I have plenty of time. Plenty of time. Their whole shoreline's wiped out. The strait is in very good shape. And we're talking right now. You know, they wanted to talk.
With Israel focused on what it sees as existential threats from Iran and its proxies in the Middle East.
From my experience as Prime Minister, during these complex times, we must act with both great determination and great wisdom. We will discuss all the issues on the agenda, first and foremost, Iran. Naturally, our goal is to safeguard our security and also to expand the circle of peace around us.
Thank you. The Israeli Prime Minister's no stranger to American presidents, having also forged relationships with Clinton, Bush, Obama and Biden. Despite the ties that bind them, Trump and Netanyahu hadn't met in person since the war began at the end of February this year. The Israeli Prime Minister notably absent from peace talks and the signing of a memorandum of understanding with Iran.
Are you on the same page on Iran, you and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Yeah, pretty close. We have a little difference, but pretty close, yeah.
Trump says his relationship with Netanyahu is strong, but he was angry at Israeli attacks on Lebanon, threatening his deal.
Without the United States, there would be no Israel. Without me, there would be no Israel, because no other president was willing to do what I did. I've had a great relationship with Bibi, but now Bibi has to be more responsible with respect to Lebanon.
The two men are being brought together by the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham, being held here at Washington's National Cathedral. The veteran senator from South Carolina was a close confidant of Benjamin Netanyahu and a strong supporter of Israel. But the US president knows that kind of backing is in decline in America. A lot has changed since Netanyahu addressed Congress in 2024. At their last White House meeting at the start of February, the Israeli PM pitched the case for attacking Iran. This meeting reveals whether they're still on the same page. Richard Gaisford, Al Jazeera, Washington.
And joining me now to discuss this is Jeffrey Feltman, former U.S. ambassador to Lebanon and an assistant secretary of state for Near East Affairs, as well as Michael Ratney, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And for our purposes, the former top diplomat in Jerusalem, which is where we met. I won't say how many years ago. It'll date us both. But this is a fascinating day. The last time that Netanyahu visited was in February, right before this war kicked off. He was coming here to try to convince Trump to join forces and attack Iran. Ambassador Feltman, as these two men got together today, what do you think the goals were for each?
I think the goal for Netanyahu was to be able to leave the White House without having him pull a Zelensky on him, like the first meeting that Trump had with Zelensky, because we've seen a growing divergence in goals over the Iran war, over Lebanon, and other issues. So I think Netanyahu needed to leave that meeting, showing the Israelis that he still had a bromance with Donald Trump.
Ambassador Ratney, do you think he accomplished that, given how little we have seen? There was not one of these freewheeling press conferences in the Oval Office. It was a relatively muted affair.
I think the lack of press coverage is telling. I think Netanyahu was probably nervous about how the meeting was going to go, didn't want a scene on television that gets viewed by all of his potential voters back in Israel. And Trump, at this point, Netanyahu is something of a liability for him, certainly unpopular, not only with Democrats, but with his MAGA base. So I think Trump probably saw no particular benefit in being seen to be chummy with the Israeli prime minister right now.
Do you think each was trying to bring the other to their side because they do have these diverging goals?
So I think Netanyahu's facing an election soon, and Trump used to be one of his biggest kind of allies and supporters, and he was hoping that he would get Trump to say positive things about him in advance of the election. I think he was probably trying to shape that to some degree, but also shape Trump's thinking on the war with Iran and in South Lebanon as well. Trump, for his part, my sense is he's just tired of Netanyahu trying to shape his thinking.
The goals are very divergent. You have the Israelis who would like to see regime change and the decimation of military and nuclear infrastructure. And essentially, at this point, it looks like the Trump administration is looking for an off-ramp. They would like a diplomatic resolution. They would like to see the Strait of Hormuz reopened. Ambassador Feltman, what are the priorities for Netanyahu here? Is it those war aims, or is it, as Ambassador Ratney says, that this the looming elections this fall?
I think it's all connected. The war aims and the elections. That Netanyahu wants to be able to show that he has a positive relationship with Trump, and that the risk of Iran has receded because of their friendship, because of their cooperation together. So I think this is all mixed up together. But I think it's very complicated for him because he knows that he can't look as though he's manipulating the U.S. president, because there was that accusation. But he needs to be able to demonstrate that he has influence with the president, that they're closely cooperating, and that's what Trump denied him today by not having the press there. And I think that from Trump's perspective, if Netanyahu expected an endorsement for his election, Trump doesn't like to back losers. And right now, you've got 60% of the Israelis who are saying they'd like somebody else.
When the two men disagree, as they have in the past, this is not the first time, and perhaps this is a silly question, but Netanyahu is a crafty fellow. When the two sides disagree, Ambassador Ratney, who tends to win out?
Yeah, interesting question. I think, in a way, Trump gets to win out because Netanyahu is very reluctant to get crossways with him publicly and be seen publicly disagreeing with him or ignoring him. And Trump very much wants to be seen as the biggest fish in the pond. It's a very patronizing relationship. But Netanyahu does have sort of passive-aggressive ways to get his way. It's a disaster in the West Bank right now. Trump isn't really focused on that, so it gives Netanyahu latitude with his kind of extremist wing. South Lebanon's a complicated picture. Trump might say things like he wants Bibi to be cooperative and get the IDF out of South Lebanon, but Bibi has a way of sort of agreeing to do it, but at the same time sort of continuing with his own approach.
But it's worth remembering from September 2023, after the Israelis struck the Hamas facility in Doha, Qatar, that Trump got Netanyahu to apologize. Yeah. And being Bibi means never having to say you're sorry.
In public, on the phone, in front of the press in the Oval Office. That was an absolutely remarkable moment. I mean, oftentimes people cast this relationship as the senior partner in the U.S., the junior partner in Israel. Ambassador Ratney, you just said the word patronizing. I want to play for our viewers a moment during this war. This was back in May when reporters asked President Trump about Prime Minister Netanyahu and how long to hold off on strikes on Iran. Trump said this. Take a listen.
What did you say to Prime Minister Netanyahu about Iran and how long to hold off?
He's fine. He'll do whatever I want him to do. He's a very, very good man. He'll do whatever I want him to do, and he's a great guy.
So, Ambassador Ratney, it may be the case that they will follow Trump's lead or essentially listen to what Trump has to say, but Israel does have enormous agency here, and they have shown that they're willing to do things without giving the U.S. a heads up, whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration. So what cards do you think Netanyahu has left to play to advance these war aims in Iran?
I mean, I think he's still quite manipulative, and I think he can cast his argument in ways that seems appealing for the moment, and I'm sure he'll try to deploy that, or did try to deploy that, in the Oval Office. There's also things that he can do to sort of pursue his policies, whether in South Lebanon or in Syria or elsewhere, kind of without telling the United States. And after the fact, Trump might grumble about it, but the deed is done. So he does have an ability to sort of get his way, but he is curtailed, because I think he does not want a situation where Trump makes statements like he just made in that clip, clearly patronizing, sometimes denigrating, and then leaking things that are even much, much worse than that, really harsh language about Bibi. That doesn't help him, especially not as he's facing an election in a couple of months.
When you look at the path forward here, Ambassador Feltman, with the Trump administration, at least until this weekend, they're ramping things up militarily. What's your sense of what the administration is doing right now?
I mean, that's a pretty tough question because Trump is unpredictable. Trump's capricious. The Iranian decision-making is completely opaque. And on top of that, we have fog of war. So between Trump's capriciousness, fog of war, and Iranian opaqueness, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. But I think what you said earlier is correct. He's looking for an off-ramp. And I have to wonder, is Pickaxe Mountain the off-ramp? You know, that he does something on Pickaxe Mountain that allows him to say, okay, now the war's over. We go back to figuring out how we're going to work out arrangements for Hormuz.
How aggressively does it seem to you that the Israelis are trying to direct the U.S. side towards carrying out a strike on Pickaxe Mountain?
It's not clear to me how far. My guess is that Netanyahu, who said he was bringing in new intelligence, Trump was dismissive of that. But he said, you know, I don't need what he has to tell me. I know everything I need to know. But I would imagine that they are pushing fairly hard for resumption of the war, and that this would be, you know, they're focused on the fact that President Trump keeps talking about Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And so Pickaxe Mountain becomes part of the Israeli narrative. You need to hit that to stop the nuclear program.
I want to talk about the dramatic shift that we've seen towards Israel in this country, both in the wake of the war in Gaza and now this war in Iran, which is entering its 6th month. The American political consensus on Israel has shown that dramatic shift and real division in this country. There was an AP poll from the Associated Press that just showed a steep shift in support for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Just 20% of American adults have a favorable view of the Israeli prime minister, while about twice as many, some 38%, have an unfavorable view. And what was once a largely unified position in terms of supporting Israel is becoming a far more contentious issue, with leaders in both American parties increasingly willing to voice public criticism. Bernard Smith explains.
New York's mayor is perhaps the most prominent U.S. politician who's not afraid to criticize Israel's leaders.
Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal, the architect of a horrific genocide against the Palestinian people. He is responsible for the killing of more than 73,000 people.
But negative views of Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel are becoming increasingly mainstream on the right as well as the left of U.S. politics.
80% of Democrats have an unfavorable view of Israel. It's been creeping up since 2022. 57% of Republicans under 49 years old feel the same way. Most older Republicans still view Israel positively. 57% of Democrats have no confidence in Benjamin Netanyahu. 44% of Republicans feel the same way, but the under 50s are twice as likely to have a negative view of Israel.
High-profile politicians are increasingly willing to reflect those views. Democratic Senators Chris Van Hollen and Jeff Merkley say America is complicit in an Israeli plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. While former fierce Trump loyalist Marjorie Taylor Greene is the first Republican politician to refer to a genocide in Gaza. Once it might have been political suicide for any potential presidential candidate to be anything but 100% supportive of Israel. Not anymore.
For too long, American policy towards Israel operated under the assumption that the best thing Washington can do for Jerusalem is to blindly, to silently stand behind your government, without conditions, without demands, without consequences, even when we disagreed. That has been our mistake, and it's been not a favor to you.
While the vice president spoke out against some Israeli leaders who'd criticized a deal the U.S. reached with Iran.
Donald J. Trump is the only head of state in the entire world who is sympathetic to the nation of Israel at this moment in time. And he happens to be the head of state of the world's superpower. If I was in the cabinet of the Israeli government, I might not be attacking the only powerful ally that I have anywhere left in the entire world.
The Israeli government knows it has an image problem. According to the Times of Israel, it's quintupled its PR budget in the US this year to $730 million. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Washington.
When you see these falling poll numbers, Ambassador Ratney, how do you think that plays into how Donald Trump handles Benjamin Netanyahu?
I mean, I think it makes Trump feel like he definitely has the upper hand, right? Trump wants to show the world that he's the stronger party, and Bibi is clearly the weaker party. And I think Bibi knows that going in, that Trump may be, as the vice president said, his last friend in the leadership of a major superpower. And I think that's got to make Bibi a little bit nervous when he goes into a meeting like this.
There was another stark moment just a few weeks ago, Ambassador Feltman, when there was a vote on military aid for Israel. And even though the measure failed, half of Democrats voted against that military aid. Do you believe that this shift that we're seeing away from Israel is growing and perhaps permanent?
I think it's growing, and I think it's frankly thanks to Bibi Netanyahu. You know, he postures as the guy who can manage the U.S. relationship. He tells the Israeli voters, "I'm the guy that can keep this partnership with America strong." But in fact, you go all the way back to 2015, where he lobbied in Congress against Obama's Iran nuclear deal. He made Israel a partisan issue from that moment. So he started losing Democrats at that moment. But it's continued with the Gaza war and with other policies to the point where he's now losing Republicans as well.
When you look at the Gulf allies, Ambassador Ratney, and again, you were the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, they have obviously stood by the U.S. in this fight. Some of them, like the Qataris, have been trying to broker peace. What are the Gulf allies telling Donald Trump right now, and is he listening?
I mean, I think they're telling them that we've got to de-escalate this war. Right. I think they were ambivalent about it for a while. They didn't want the war to start. Once we were in the middle of it and the Strait of Hormuz was closed, their view was you can't just stop now and leave it the way it is, with basically the sword of Damocles over the Strait of Hormuz and no ability to export oil. Then the 14-point MOU, imperfect as it was, at least got commerce going again. And I think the message from the Gulf is, whatever you do, let's just not see a return to open conflict. Let's allow oil to flow, economies to breathe. And I think they're nervous because Trump threatening a re-escalation of this conflict, sending all these military forces to the Gulf, sometimes creates its own dynamic.
And, you know, when you look at what's going on in Lebanon, much of the South has been razed, and there's now this framework deal on the table. Essentially, it seems like the Trump administration has tried to separate this from the Iran war, which I think you would agree is perhaps impossible. Ambassador Feltman, when you look at the support that the Trump administration has given to the Lebanese government, is that enough in terms of the goal of disarming Hezbollah? And have they put enough pressure on Israel to withdraw?
The meeting here last week between the Lebanese President Joseph Aoun and the U.S. President Donald Trump was a political success for the Lebanese government. It sort of reaffirmed that this is a government in Lebanon that wants to assert its sovereignty over the whole country, which a lot of previous governments you questioned about. So I think that the U.S. has been sending the right political signals. But there's a real dilemma here, which is that Hezbollah is not willingly going to put down its arms, and the Israelis are not willingly going to withdraw from Lebanon, particularly before an Israeli election when fighting Hezbollah is very popular inside Israel. So I think that the Trump administration, I hope, has the patience to follow through with the support to the Lebanese army, with the support for reconstruction, with trying to wean the part of the Lebanese political base that's behind Hezbollah away from the Hezbollah services, to sort of isolate and marginalize Hezbollah. But it's a long, patient process, and this is not an administration known for long, patient initiatives.
I mean, that does seem to be a concern in many quarters, that they are going to get distracted, despite saying things, the right things. Many would argue. What we don't hear a lot from the Trump administration about is the West Bank, and we have seen violence flaring. A lot of tension, to say the very least. And many people do believe that the West Bank is on the brink as we see these settlers emboldened and protected by Israeli forces. Ambassador Ratney, how much do you think the Trump administration thinks and worries about what's going on in the West Bank?
I don't get the impression they focus on it all that much, which is tragic. This is an administration with a finite attention span, and they're distracted by Iran, Ukraine, a whole bunch of other things. The West Bank is probably the single most dangerous part of the Middle East right now. It's a tinderbox. You have extremist settlers running amok, provoking firefights with Palestinians, imposing checkpoints, essentially trying to make the West Bank functionally uninhabitable for Palestinians, and with the effective support of the Israeli government. I've worked there in the past. We always used to say that, there's going to be an explosion. It's unsustainable. I've never seen it like this. I've never seen it this close to the brink.
And it does seem to me that, a number of the issues that we've talked about, the war in Iran, the war in Lebanon, what's going on in the West Bank, does generally have the support of the Israeli population. Is there also a division, Ambassador Feltman, between not just Donald Trump and Netanyahu, but the U.S. administration and Americans generally and the Israeli population?
Yes, I think that the Israeli public largely supports these military operations, traumatized by the October 7th massacres, but they don't support Netanyahu. As we said, 60% is looking for another alternative. And so I think this is going to be the challenge for the administration. Even if Netanyahu does not prevail as prime minister after these elections, the likely replacements for him are probably going to be pursuing similar policies that put them at odds with the American people and increasingly with American political leaders.
I think that's a very important point to make. When you look at the landscape of candidates looking to replace Prime Minister Netanyahu, their policies are not wildly divergent on these very important issues that we've discussed today. Thank you for coming in and for covering all of the different aspects of this very important and evolving relationship. Ambassador Michael Ratney, the former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and the former U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman. Thank you both very much. And that's all from me and the team here in Washington. I want to hand it back to Richard Gaisford and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, that's it for this edition of This is America. You can watch us each weekday at 18:30 GMT. That's 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States. For now, though, from Washington, D.C., it's goodbye.